So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Mick Lynch's bad kind of arguments, still kind of supporting Brexit. And just get into this. James O'Brien does a decent job of kind of questioning Lynch over this. So let's have a listen.
To get involved.
You mentioned the TUC. They have warned about the potential impacts of the so-called retained EU law bill, which is, as you know, let me use the language of the TUC. The legislation is the brainchild of Jacob Rees-Mogg, the anti-union ex-investment manager whose previous claim to fame was taking his nap of Brexit, effectively.
Sorry, it goes on a bit longer there. But yeah, it was Mogg that pushed to have this bill passed.
They pay agents, this is for the entire workforce, especially those not protected by trade unions, holiday pay, agency worker rights, data protection rights, protections of terms and conditions for workers whose employment is transferred to another employer, collective consultation with worker representatives when redundancies are proposed, protection of pregnant workers and rights to maternity and parental leave, protection of part-time and fixed-term workers, rights relating to working time, including rights to daily and weekly rests, maximum weekly working time, paid annual leave, measures to protect night workers, protection of workers' rights on the
So when they ask you, what did the EU ever do for us, there you go, there's a whole list of them.
Insolvency of their employer and rights to a written statement of terms and conditions. These are hard-won rights that the TUC now fears are going to be abolished by legislation being pursued by the current government as a direct consequence of the Brexit you supported.
So before Lynch comes in there, it's important to acknowledge that Lynch is going to argue he did not support this. This is not the Brexit he voted for, which is funny because a lot of Brexiteers also use that same argument, the more right-wing ones. But point being is that, look, he opened the door, by voting for Brexit, regardless of any Lexiteers' views, you open the door to this. Let's not forget who was in charge of the government at the time. It was David Cameron. So had Brexit happened in a very fast fashion, right, he'd have had potentially a couple of years to really disassemble workers' rights if he wanted to, considering that the referendum was in 2016. If we had a very speedy exit to the EU within, say, a year or two, it would have given him some time, probably 1 or 2 years, to really do damage if he wanted to. If we had, say, Brexit by 2017, 18, for example, you have an election in 2019. So for Brexiteers to argue, I was supported Corbyn, all this stuff, that's fine, but it still would have taken you years if Cameron had stayed on. Or if May didn't call a snap general election, to be fair.
Direct consequence of having this government.
You can't have one without the other. Well, it's this government plus Brexit. Take away Brexit, exactly. The government couldn't do this.
Exactly.
It's true. These are... the EU sets the minimum standards, and a lot of those are the EU's minimum standards that we can't breach. Even now, under the level playing field rules, we might still face issues with it. But point being is, without Brexit, this would not have happened.
You're absolutely right. And
I know.
It's a political decision that the government we have has made.
But you've handed them the shows. It's like they're going to go and shoot your dog, but you've handed them the gun.
Not quite.
Yeah.
No. It's pretty much the same. It's, you can argue that, well, Lynch supported... he does argue he supported a different government, so he didn't really hand the Tories the gun, but, it's not a million miles away from doing that.
It's not quite like that,
well, is,
James, because if we'd voted for a different government, which I campaigned for, we wouldn't be making these changes, and a future government is free to make legislative changes that it wants and could enhance what we do, and can indeed nationalise public sector services, which you cannot do inside the European Union. You have to have liberalisation.
You have to have
competition.
You have to have competition for franchises and for routes. Although they're a lot closer in some European Union countries to nationalisation than we currently are here. Did you?
And that's the point. You have to have competition. So if we look at this tweet here from Naomi O'Leary saying, "It's so strange to hear people in Britain are still repeating that the EU law forces private ownership of railways when it's the UK is the only European country without a state-owned passenger rail service company. Because all you have to do is set up a company to run the rail service. It's kind of like how in this country, in the UK, we took over East Coast Rail Line. I think it was East Coast Rail Line, something like that, and we ran it better than the private companies that owned them at the time, and we ran that route much better, even turned a profit. So for him to argue it wasn't possible, it absolutely is possible. All you need is competition, which in this context might be a good thing, to have different, a public-owned rail company having to compete with privately owned rail companies, because they keep each other on their toes. For example, they have to actually compete with each other rather than having companies that have very limited competition and can run services really badly.
They're liberalising all of the routes in France and Spain and Germany right now.
Did you realise when you supported Brexit that a Conservative government would be able to do these things?
Well, any government could do those things.
Outside the European Union.
You have sovereign power to make...
Outside the European Union?
Yeah, you have sovereign power to make those laws.
Yeah, so you did realise that you were jeopardising potentially holiday pay, data protection rights, collective consultation, protection for pregnant workers, protection of part-time and fixed-term workers. I could go on. I did a minute ago. You can play the tape.
But all laws deriving from the European Union are then have the opportunity to be amended now.
But this is,
and that's the point. All of the laws can be amended. That's the problem, Lynch. They are going to be amended, and they are not going to be good for us. That's the point. The whole point of Mogg's bill was to either get rid of, amend, or keep former EU regulations that the UK put in whilst we're still an EU member. So what that means is the government now, because of Rees-Mogg, have a sunset period. So they have, I think, until the end of next year to really end of this year even, to figure out what they want to keep, what they want to get rid of, what they want to amend. And if they don't vote to keep in these workers' protections, they're gone. It's on a sunset clause. They're finished. That's it.
We'll get into this a bit because we didn't last time. This is the whole point from where I sit of the European Union. I spoke to Mick Whelan about this, and I think I came to a slightly better understanding. You prioritise the nationalisation of the railways above everything else.
Yeah, because it's...
And that is why you support Brexit, even when these are the costs.
It's a constitutional matter. These are not constitutional matters. The government doesn't have to change them.
But they are choosing to, because they're a bunch of morons. That's the problem. It makes it worse that it's not a constitutional matter, because it probably, if we had a proper constitution, it would be harder to change than, putting sunset clauses in to get rid of EU retained laws, for example. Mick Lynch's arguments are just really bad.
So the competition in public services, including the future of our health service and other services that are currently in the public sector.
That's nonsense, because the NHS doesn't have to compete with anyone for bids and whatever. It's nonsense to try and use the healthcare service as an argument, considering that the only times it's been privatised is because of Conservative and centre-left Labour Party governments. That's it, PFI contracts. Looking at you, Blair.
Will be at risk because of the Maastricht Treaty and other measures, because they are hard...
We signed the Maastricht Treaty years ago. They were not put at risk, big man. What are you talking about?
Wired into the Constitution, and you cannot get a derogation from them permanently. So it's our view that much of the Corbyn manifesto would not have been allowed and would have been subject to legal challenge from the EU.
It's your view. I know there are plenty of people who argue with that.
No,
mate,
I accept that.
Don't use the opinion argument. You need to come with actual facts. The French government are nationalising EDF, fully nationalising it, going from having a stake in the company to, I think, they're going for 100% ownership. Where are the lawsuits, Mick? What's going on? Just because you have an opinion doesn't mean anything. Really doesn't. You can say, it's my opinion that the Maastricht Treaty would have this impact on the NHS, but that means very little in the context of what can happen and what is the chance of something happening. You have the possibility of something happening, and you have something will happen. And saying the NHS is open up to privatisation and these competition rules is ridiculous.
We take a view. People say we're ardent Brexiteers. We're not. We were asked a question.
I didn't use that word.
No, but people do in general.
Okay.
Many of your callers
maybe
and tweeters will say that. We were asked a question by a government that was elected to have a referendum. Our view was that our view on public ownership was an important one based on our principles.
So you're...
I think what this lot wanted to be is more like Norway, with absolute privatisation, with no real competition. And for Norway, I think it works well. They're a very well run country, but what the EU kind of pushes for is competition. So public services, for the most part, in certain industries, have to compete with private sector rivals. Bids have to go out for tender, for example, things like that. And that can also be a good system. It can be a good system, but the problem is certain bits of the left don't accept that, and it's very frustrating.
Support for Brexit was built entirely upon its impact upon your industry and not the country.
Well, we do have a belief that the country should be able to set its own laws as well, and there are consequences to that. I take that.
Sovereignty. Oh, mate, you did not just use the sovereignty argument. Jesus Christ, Mick.
And those consequences are the potential abolition of some of the things that would once... It's the TUC that are saying this.
The TUC has a different position to our union.
On this issue.
And that's legitimate.
Of course it is. But the Trades Unions Congress, with whom you have a lot in common, historically...
The TUC are higher up. The TUC can call it a general strike if they wanted to, if they got the votes for it. Lynch can't do that. The TUC are above Lynch's union.
will campaign,
are warning against the abolition of some of the hardest won workers' rights in the history of civilization, and you are partly responsible, or your position on Brexit is partly responsible for the freedom that the Conservative government has to now abolish them.
And we will campaign against those changes
Well,
with
good
all
luck.
the other
They've got like a 70+ seat majority, mate. You can't campaign against nothing. You can't beat that. You can't beat that. The ERG are running the game now. You know, they're the ones who really want this stuff to go. You can't beat them. What are you going to do? Talk Rees-Mogg and Brexit hardman Steve Baker to death? Like, what's your plan here, Chief? What's your plan here?
unions, and if they change, we will campaign for a new workers' rights bill under a future government, which we're being told is
and does it
going
still
to come through.
Does it still trump all the other cards then? If there was a referendum tomorrow to rejoin the European Union, would the RMT still encourage its members or still adopt the position of resisting that?
Well, we'd have to think about that. If that was what was on the balance sheet, we would consider the position on the balance sheet.
All right.
Bro, we live in a country, right, that traditionally goes from Labour to Conservative. So you could have created a system where Labour would try and implement certain workers' rights, and then the Tories would just come in and get rid of them. And you can argue, well, wouldn't that be done for voters to vote for a party that will get rid of their workers' rights? I got news for you, Chief. That's us. We are that country. We are a country that votes for less rights because we vote for the Tories. We give them majorities. You know, you can argue first past the post and all of this stuff, but given that the fact that the Tories win a consistent vote share, there are a consistent amount of idiots in this country that are happy to give up their rights and other people's rights because maybe they hate foreigners, maybe because they've got some money or a lot of money. I don't know why people vote Conservative, maybe because they just really hate change. But, you know, Lynch's arguments here are just really stupid. Like, if the railway services had more competition, if there were more companies bidding for it, you would get much cheaper rail fares. You know, if you look at the difference between the cost of a plane ticket versus a train ticket, it's very different because I think there's a lot more competition for you to travel via plane than is to travel via train. And I don't think the plane companies get as much subsidies as the train ones do either. Come on, Mick, mate. Like, I get he wants to stick to his guns, and you know, a lot of people were desperate for a Corbyn government who would have ushered in this kind of nationalised utopia. But the fact is, it didn't happen, and what you've done is open the door for this lot to come in and just skewer workers' rights because there aren't any EU protections anymore. The closest thing we have to an EU protection would be potentially the Northern Ireland Protocol, depending on how it works for workers' rights over there, because the EU obviously don't want to give a competitive edge to Northern Ireland, depending on how it's written and what clauses there are, and of course the level playing field, which means that I don't think the UK is really allowed to go below the current EU standards when the deal was signed. But again, that's going to go through a whole host of lawyers and other things. It might lead to the EU putting tariffs on us, for example, on certain goods or a lot of goods. It might lead to the end of the TCA. But that's the closest thing we can get to hoping that the government don't go through with their plans to get rid of the former EU protections that we used to have. Because I tell you what, getting rid of a lot of these protections beyond just holiday pay would be a nightmare for a lot of people. A real bad situation for a lot of people. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.